so the session will be recorded. I'm glad you've all found a way to log in and to join the class. Thank you again for that. Today I'm going to try to move us from where we started, which is from the notion of belonging. And one of the things I tried to do in the hour that we have together is to put into place some of the conditions that will allow us to feel like we, in some sort of way, belong together in this educational exercise of trying to come to some sort of understanding of what citizenship and what belonging and what a globalized world and Canada's place in it all mean. And I organized the first assignments in order to, with the hope of being able to provide an occasion for you to be subjective about this. Part of my own conclusion as a sort of a scholar, in this area, is that there's a strong tendency to avoid the subjective component, a strong tendency, I have to admit, I'm inclined to, and so I need to correct that. And part of what I wanted to do in these discussion boards is to provide you with an opportunity to articulate your own sense of belonging and non-belonging and the different dynamics as you've experienced them firsthand. So in the first person, your own sense of if you belong or don't belong in the different areas where you might belong or not belong, but also to reflect on, from a third person point of view, other people. So you might remember from high school noticing that someone didn't belong or felt like they didn't belong. Both of those are subjective components, and they're crucial components. Today I want to open up the discussion. I want to turn the direction of the discussion, and I want to develop some theoretical perspectives that a number of scholars in the field of migration and Canada and citizenship and so on have been trying to spell out for a number of different purposes, united, if only, by the format of their work, which is to say academic publishing. So these are all more or less social scientific discussions that I'm going to be drawing on in order to try to demonstrate to you that in your own subjective experiences around belonging and identity and migration, these theoretical constructs will allow you to recognize aspects of your own experience. Sometimes they'll allow you to recognize aspects you weren't aware of. Sometimes they'll allow you to better connect two different aspects that you didn't experience as directly connected, but the theoretical construct will offer you a way to see how they relate to each other. So the first thing I want to do to start building that bridge is I want to take a look. I collected some of the comments, some of the claims that you made in your first discussion group, and I want to use them to make a connection to this theoretical framework that I'm going to try to describe. So we'll start with that. I'm going to switch now so that we can read together some of these claims. I didn't identify by name the people who made these claims. They're all available in the discussion board. And I didn't pick these claims because I didn't pick these claims only or necessarily because I think they were great or terrible or right or wrong, but because they allow me to raise a couple of points that I think will help us to move this thing forward. So I'd like to try to share this. No, that's the wrong one. Okay, so now they're not in order. It's the second one I want to take a look at first. So one of you wrote, I also agree that money and power determine and shape many things, but unfortunately, this is everywhere globally. Unfortunately, economic systems that you can see all over the world is the reason for this, and it is another topic of discussion. What doesn't change is change itself. So that last sentence probably I could have left out. And in a way, what I want to try to demonstrate to you, what I want to try to begin to spell out for you is one specific theoretical framework that tries to address what is described in this comment as unfortunate, and that is that economic systems are another topic of discussion. And I want to try to, and in a certain way, it seems to me that the shortcoming of the textbook or the book that the main reading so far was drawn from, that is the book The Making of the Mosaic, basically adopts this strategy. In the chapter we looked at, they claim that they try to tie these discussions together, but in fact, over the course of the book, they don't. They simply repeat in a variety of different ways this same claim that the economy is separate from all of these things. Now, the way that manifests itself in the book is that they identify as self-evidently and sort of autonomously constructed the interests of labor on the one hand and the interests of business on the other, as though those two aren't problematically but intrinsically related one to the other. And then on the other hand, they separate out the business interests and labor interests from the institutions through which these interests, on the model described in the book, through which these interests negotiate Canadian policy. And I'm going to try to demonstrate to you, or I'm going to offer to you the fundamental aspects of an alternative theoretical approach that starts from, in a way, the opposite point of view, namely that the political and the economic are deeply and necessarily intertwined. That is, that you can't understand politics without understanding economics, and also, though, that you can't understand economics without understanding politics. And so we'll turn to that in a minute. In a lot of ways, it seems to me anyway, a very common sense approach, but one of the conclusions or one of the ongoing discussions in support of that view keeps coming back to the ability with which the class whose interests are the business interests manage to get their way, basically. The bottom line, the conclusion of the book, I agree with, and that is that Canadian immigration policy has been determined in the final analysis by business interests. Why is that, though? And that's the question that has to be, that I think is better described by this framework I'm going to take a look at, and I'm going to try to introduce you to. But I want to make one quick point about the discussion board contributions generally before I turn to the PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared for today. One of the I took this particular quote, but I found versions of it in many, many of your contributions. And I hear students say this all the time. Ever since, for as long as I've been teaching, I hear students make this same claim. And I want to try to slow it down a little bit. I disagree with it, but I want to try to make my disagreement a little bit more understandable. So I'm not going to try to convince you. My goal here isn't necessarily to convince you that this is mistaken. I just want you to see that it's not quite as obvious as so many of you seem to think that it is. So the claim was, it is a great point that everyone has different view about the definition and feeling of home. Now, if that's literally true, then there's no point in talking about home. In French, there's a saying, and I'll say it in French, then I'll translate it. Les goûts et les couleurs ne se discutent pas. So that tastes and colors are not discussed, and it means both that they cannot be discussed and also that they ought not to be discussed. And that's partly a problematic thing, because in fact, les goûts et les couleurs sont discutés tout le temps. Tastes and colors are the topic of conversation over and over and over, and in fact, it can work. But it can only work to the degree that we're able to convince each other that we're talking about at least roughly similar things. If we can't do that, then it's true. We cannot discuss blue or some dish, some meal, or whether this movie is good, and so on. It is not a great point that everyone has a different view about the definition and feeling of home, because if it's true, then we couldn't possibly talk about it. If what you meant by home was a movie or 7 + 9 or any number of things, then none of us wouldn't be able to have these conversations. I think the point that mostly students are trying to raise when they start their argument with this position, with this claim, okay, I'll just finish my point and then turn it over for a second. The idea is that there are many different views, not that every single person has a completely different view from every other person. It's rather that there are many different views, and that they're different views of the same thing is the key point. Does anyone have anything to say, to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Professor. Everybody has a different opinion from one point, and that
is the opposite of my point. I disagree with that claim.
So you mean everybody has to go at the same point, and the same point, and explanation would be the same thing?
No, but those aren't the opposites. As long as two people out of the whole planet have the same point of view, then that proves that that claim is false. What this claim says is that every single person on our planet has a different point of view and a different definition of home. And I'm saying it's unlikely that that's true. And the only way to know that would be to ask every single person on our planet. And no one's ever done that. It's not a doable thing. It doesn't even make sense.
Totally agree.
Pardon?
Yeah, totally agree. You're right.
Right. And so the important point is that there are significant differences about how people will relate to and understand and try to think about and act on and all of that. Challenge that faces us as sorry, go ahead. Okay, well then, so I just want to give you an example of the consequences and maybe the advantages of being as accurate as you can in your discussion. points weren't taken off or anything like that. I just want to, it occurred to me that it's a service I can do to you, offer you. But anyway, I'm going to turn now to my slide presentation. Maybe. Okay. So the name of the framework that I'm going to offer as a counter theoretical position, or an alternative theoretical position to the one that's developed by Trebilcock and Kelly. And I mean, it's worth knowing the position developed by Trebilcock and Kelly is a very widely developed, widely held position in academic and maybe even more widely in policy circles. So I'm not making the claim that they're way out to lunch, or that they're that what they're saying is wacky or anything like that. I think it's incomplete in a specifiable way, and I want to call to your attention that there exists within the academic world, and again to a much lesser degree in the policy world, an alternative viewpoint that's organized specifically in order to address the shortcomings that I identified. And the name of that perspective, the label, the academic label, is international political economy. And that's a general academic field that turns its attention to all the different aspects of how politics and the economy are organized around the world. In the last 10 or 20 years, there's been from the very beginning, since people have been doing this kind of academic work, there's been definitional disagreements, but in particular, the idea that international is the right term as opposed to, say, global or something else, something along those. Transnational is another version of this. All of these are debated issues that if you were to pursue this in graduate school, you would early on in your pursuit of this in graduate school, you'd have to master some of these differences. But for our purposes, I'm going to move forward and just sort of alert you to the fact that international political economy is the name of this thing that I want to do. So why approach it from that point of view? Well, in the book, The Making of the Mosaic, the claim they defend, notwithstanding their own theoretical introduction, the conclusion they reach is that Canadian immigration policy is driven by the labor requirements of the business class. Business groups, the Chamber of Commerce, all of the different names that the organized representations of the business class have taken over the course of Canadian history, their lobbying efforts are identified by the authors of our book as the most successful and the determining driver of the changes in Canadian immigration policy over the course of Canadian history, from even before 1867 right up until today. So I'm suggesting we take a closer look at that. Why is it, and how is it that we can understand what those labor requirements are? And more significantly, will that take us to different conclusions from, and a different description even from that offered by Trebilcock and Kelly in their work? So in another book on I drew this quote from, and I thought I had included, it's by Russell King, from Types and Typologies of Theories of Migration. He writes, "It is one of the ironies of globalization that whilst goods, capital, knowledge, entrepreneurship, and the media are free to flow, freer is probably more accurate, but are free to flow across borders, labor, that other crucial factor of production, is not. In fact, on the whole, people are less free to migrate now than they were 100 years ago. And I chose this quote because it seemed to me that the framing of it allows me to introduce a particular logical component that I think is very important to understand how IPE, international political economy, differs from the approach that was sketched out by Trebilcock and Kelly. And rather than seeing it as an irony of globalization, I want to stress that it's more accurate to see it as a contradiction. It's an unstable feature. It's an unmaintainable component of globalization. Capital cannot flow freely across borders without having an impact on how labor is going to flow. Now, the notion that labor flows freely ends up being unhelpful when we try to better understand how it is that people who do the labor and other people who don't do labor flow across these borders. But it's the notion that it's ironic. I want to push that a little bit. And instead of using a kind of literary description, irony is a literary term, I want to use a logical term and to try to demonstrate what factors are contradicting each other in this characterization in this feature of globalization since World War II anyway. So in another book, this time in a chapter, in a chapter specifically about Canada, the book is Migration in the 21st Century, Political Economy and Ethnography. The author wrote, in Canada, as elsewhere, employing migrant labor is not just convenient to capitalism, but has become a central component of the political economy, allowing a captive, disposable, replaceable, just-in-time labor force to do the most difficult work with wages, conditions, and benefits deemed unacceptable to most domestic workers. Domestic here is meant not in terms of the work that's being done, but in terms of where the workers are from. So in Canada, the Canadian business class has been pushing the Canadian government to encourage the migration of laborers to do, in part, what part of the policies that have been developed and promoted by and largely pursued are that a significant percentage, a significant segment of the labor of the immigration population is accepted into Canada and in a way recruited to Canada in order to do a specific part of the work that's required for Canadian society to survive and to keep moving. And that is to do the most difficult work with the worst working conditions. Now, these are meant to be social scientific generalizations. They're not meant to be an absolute or a total description. It's not meant, the claim here is not that every single migrant worker hates every single aspect of the work that they do. And it's not meant to say that every single migrant laborer is hired to do work that not a single Canadian is prepared to or able or wants to do. The claim, rather, is a widely used kind of social scientific claim that when you take a look at the labor market overall in Canada, if you go to a hotel, well, not today because they're all more or less closed, but if you went to a hotel in December of 2019 and you looked at who was making the lowest wages and what kind of work they were doing and where they were from, you would find that far more of the people at the lowest segment of the wage structure are first and second generation migrants, whereas at the top of the wage structure, that's not nearly the case to the same degree. And this is against background conditions where it's hard for everybody who doesn't have certain kinds of skills and experience to get jobs. And so we have a question: why is the Canadian labor market organized the way it is? And is there a connection between the way the Canadian labor market is organized internally and the way the global labor market operates? And the political economy point of view is to say that it doesn't even make sense to ask the question all by itself: how is the Canadian labor market structured? The Canadian labor market, all labor markets, but we're talking about Canada, the Canadian labor market from the very beginning was determined in important ways by the international global economy. So, the political economy point of view, briefly captured, and here it's more of a slogan, and each part of this requires quite a bit more theoretical and empirical development, but just to get the main thing on the table, the claim is that economic phenomena cannot be properly understood except in their relevant political framework, and also political phenomena cannot be understood except in their relevant economic framework. Now, most broadly, political economy operates on the sort of starting point that these two lines of analysis are not necessarily, they're not analytically reducible one to the other. That is to say that the political framework within which economic phenomena must be understood is not necessarily going to line up identically with the political phenomena that need to be understood in terms of the economic framework. And in a certain way, that lack of identity, that lack of perfect overlapping, is what most political economists believe is the cause of the contradictions that exist in the contemporary world. And one of the dimensions of that contradiction manifested itself in the sort of the overall content of the discussion groups of the first set of discussion boards. Some of the students reported that they felt that they were welcome. They identified themselves, the students in their own discussion, in their own contributions, described themselves as migrants born somewhere else and living here. And they discussed and they articulated their experience as not perfect, but as good. Other students described their experience as not perfectly terrible, or whatever. I don't know if there's a word in English for perfectly terrible, but not as absolutely terrible, but as markedly, recognizably suboptimal with respect in particular to the failure of the disconnect between, the disengagement between their own expectations of being able to belong and the ability of society in which they're now living to find a place for them. Some of you described it in terms of your work experience. Some of you described it in terms of your school experience, or some of you described it in terms of your broader life experience. Some of it had to do with economic factors. Some of it had to do with cultural factors. It's this lack of perfect overlapping of seamlessness that political economy as a social science describes as the contradiction between these. And that's the general framework that it's that academic general framework that I'm going to be drawing on to try to get us to think a little bit more about the ways that citizenship and globalization and belonging interact, one and the other, both on this, both in the big picture in terms of what Canadian society operates like, and also in terms of our own experiences of being human beings in the world and in the places and in the conditions in which we are. So, no. So for the most part, what I want to take a look at is the argument, an argument that's been developed by Harold Bauder, who is now a professor at Ryerson University. He's German, and he taught in Germany for a while, but then he was hired by Ryerson to be the first Canada research chair in migrate. I forget what the position was, but he was the sort of the inaugural chair of this research board. So he came to Canada. His area of research is basically he compares Germany and Canada as countries that accept migrants. And in particular, what that chapter is about in the book that it's taken from is the regulation of labor markets through migration. He tries to describe in that book how is it that migration operates as, how does migration regulate labor markets? Now, going back for a minute to Treblecock and Kelly's description of the history and development of Canadian immigration policy, you'll recall, I hope, because I've mentioned it 79 times, the main tool of analysis that's brought to bear on the material that they look at is the interactions between, on the one hand, ideas, and on the other hand, interests. And the interests that they identified were, roughly speaking, the economic interests of the business class and the economic interests of labor. And the tendency in the book is to reduce the interests of the business class to what is, if you were going to if you tried to understand what is it the business class, if there's such a thing, I'm convinced there is, but that is a controversial and debatable claim, I guess. But what is how would you describe, how would you characterize the interest of the business class? When organized business hires lobbyists to go to the federal government, what is it they're asking for? What are some of the things that the mining sector wants from, or the oil sector, or the high tech sector, or pharma? When the lobbyists for those sectors, okay, tax cuts, loans is a little trickier, but let's say tax cuts. That's certainly one thing. Why is it what is it they want tax cuts for? But why is it they say so? Ultimately, it's it's because any tax they didn't have to pay, more or less, any tax they didn't have to pay would just end up in their pockets, something like that. But by and large, the organized business community understands that taxes are necessary for that certain taxes, some level of taxation is necessary for the smooth operating, the continued operation of businesses in Canadian society. So they don't generally go in and say all taxes should be eliminated. It's particular taxes. What they want to do is they want to be left to invest their capital to the greatest degree possible without government interference in their investments. But what is it that how do businesses benefit from some of the money that government spends? What does the government provide to business that allows them to get a return on their investment? For instance, I'm not sure what you mean. What incentives?
Uh, it could be like if they invest, say for example, in a certain city, because generally smaller cities have less taxes, so it'll benefit the community there, and that way they can write that off, or they can claim that okay, they benefited this community, or if they do what is it? I think it's called corporate social responsibility claims, so, so that kind of thing,
Right. Where I wanted to go, you jumped a couple of steps. That's good in a way. Part of what I wanted to put on the table is that when business interests are broadly believed to coincide in at least a number of ways with the general good. When business takes a public position on any issue, in general, they try to highlight the way that business being successful means that the community, the society, the country, or the province or the city will be successful. The argument is that as business succeeds, so does the rest of the population succeed. Does that seem roughly an accurate characterization of the way business lobbies operate? Right. And so what we need to try to understand is first of all, how accurate a claim is that? And secondly, what particular ways does business pursue its interests in terms of labor? And so what business will say is that they'll oppose a certain tax. So for instance, in the last Canadian election, the NDP clearly, the last federal election, and the Liberal Party a little bit less clearly, both advocated raising the minimum wage. And many business lobbies argued against raising the minimum wage. In the United States, this is on the table right now. Joe Biden more sort of promised that. And many organized businesses pushed back against that. What's the business argument against raising the minimum wage? The business argument is not, oh my goodness, that will cost. What I mean by the business argument is when business lobbyists go to the government, or when they they have someone write an article in the newspaper, or when their think tanks present a defense of their own tax proposals, what they argue is not, oh, it's good for our profits. We just don't want to pay those workers more money. They have a different kind of argument. What's that other argument? What's the problem with raising minimum wage?
They say the other products or services that they offer will increase, and that's pretty much gonna cause. I want to say inflation, but it's just gonna cost of living. That's it.
Right. So one of the arguments is that because of the way a marketplace operates, not because of employer greed, not because of shareholder greed, but because of the way supply and demand interact one with the other. If the Tim Hortons has to raise the wages of their employees, they're going to have to raise the cost of their coffee, of their donuts, etc. And if all of the businesses do that, what'll end up happening is that $15 an hour won't buy you as much as the $14 an hour would have bought you had this raise not gone in. Plus, and in a way, this is the argument that's pressed more strongly. Plus, they won't be able to hire as many people. Many businesses operate on fairly thin margins. And one of the components that goes into the margin is the wage. And so if their wage bill is higher, then at a certain point it no longer makes sense for them to stay in business. And their shareholders simply take the capital from that business and they move it to another place to invest their capital where they'll be able to get a better return on that money. So Don's point about it allegedly the claim is that it will diminish the Canadian business environment's ability to compete globally against other economies that don't have that constraint. The political economy point of view challenges that argument. Now, just from an economics point of view, the evidence is at best very mixed about what in fact happens in an economic marketplace when all of those things occur. And that's partly because the actual economy operates in a political and a social and an environmental and a cultural context. It doesn't operate in an abstract world. Economists are typically very good at modeling. They're very good at keeping their pencil sharp. The challenge that economics as a science faces is in mapping their formal models onto the messy real world of our everyday lives. And the point that political economy raises is that it's a methodological, philosophical mistake to try to describe the economy as a self-standing entity. And there are historical reasons for that, mainly in a certain kind of way, the founder of economics. Does anyone have an idea who typically is identified as the founder of economics? No, it's Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote, his most famous book is The Wealth of Nations. And by and large, what Adam Smith was engaged in trying to do was to do for human society what Isaac Newton had done for the motion of matter in the universe. So Isaac Newton came up with his first and second and third law of motion. And that Isaac Newton's contribution to physics was to provide a mathematical framework, a universal in the sense of the entire universe, a cosmological, mathematically verifiable account of how matter moves. And it was extraordinarily powerful, Newton's revolution in physics. I mean, he didn't do it by himself, and it's complicated, of course, but in a certain kind of way, Adam Smith was proposing to offer for human societies the same sort of effort. Adam Smith understood that in many ways, human society is infinitely more complicated than simply the motion of matter. But the idea was economics eventually is going to be able to offer laws the way physics could offer laws, laws that accurately predicted what the future would look like as long as they had accurate description of what the present is like now. The trouble, the challenge that economics has faced since the time of Adam Smith right up until today, one description of that is that human agents are not perfect economic actors. Even when humans have more and more and more and approximate closer and closer and closer to total information, for whatever reason, humans still don't behave in the completely rational way that is the assumption of, that is the essential central assumption of economics as a science. And what political economy suggests is that it's the initial assumption that's mistaken. The idea that the economy is structured of independently and potentially autonomous actors doesn't correspond to our experience of what it's like to be a human. And it doesn't offer us an empirical model that is especially good at describing how humans behave. Over and over and over, economic models end up having to be adjusted and amended because humans don't behave as rational beings. And the discipline, the corrections that the economy imposes on humans, although it's absolutely not negligible, political economy is not doesn't deny that the creation and distribution of wealth is very, very important to humans. Absolutely, that is accepted by and one of the starting points of the political economy perspective. But the claim is that it's never going to be available to explain if you start from the assumption that humans are perfectly rational or even could be perfectly rational. And the problem with that is not because we're not smart enough, it's because we don't exist as independent, as absolutely independent economic atoms in a economic universe. We're born and we remain and we grow and we thrive as interdependent beings. And over in all of your discussions, or in many of your discussions anyway, when you described what does it feel like to belong, and also what does it feel like to not belong, what it's about, that feeling is the ability or the disability in making connections with other people. And that is absolutely important. And it's the way I framed the question, and I framed it for a reason, and I think it's important, but it doesn't exhaust everything. You were able to, and I encouraged you, and I'm pleased, I'm thrilled, I'm honored, really, that you were willing to go there. You translated into your feelings. But a number of you made the connection, the important connection, that it's not just about feelings. It's not the case that it's simply sad if you don't connect with your fellow workers. It's also the case, and it's very easy to demonstrate, in a workplace where the workers don't feel like they're connecting with each other, they're not as productive. More accidents happen. So it's not just that the bosses don't make more money. It's also that the service that's provided, the goal for which the people are brought together in that workplace, is not achieved as efficiently and as effectively as it otherwise would when the workers doing the work don't feel like they're connected to each other. Our survival on the pushed to its strongest statement, our survival on Earth depends on this fact that we are and are able to connect to each other. And that view is the importance of that view is sort of the central claim. I'll be with you in 2 seconds, Don. That's the central claim of political economy. So now let me see what Don said. Well, so you raise an important point. It is, I agree that it's counterintuitive. I think even more strongly, I think it's just a lie. My own sort of academic personal position on this is that capitalism can't possibly work. I think that organizing the economy on the basis of maximizing wealth is doomed to failure. That it embodies a specific contradiction, but that's a much more controversial claim than is necessary. So the not all political economy is written from a Marxist point of view. Political economy predates Marx, and Adam Smith described what he was doing as political economy. And Adam Smith's job was a professor of moral philosophy. Now, the job descriptions when Adam Smith was alive were very different. There were no economics professors, there was no accounting professor or banking professor. Nonetheless, Adam Smith's writings were deeply and totally committed to and about increasing human well-being. And so he was absolutely interested in and committed to, I think he was mistaken, but what he was writing about was how can we create, how can we continue to improve human society in the directions that he thought human society was improving in his lifetime and in the history leading to his lifetime. And so money flowing, it's true that money flowing is the economy, or I mean, one area where Marx and most contemporary economists agree is that money flowing is an economy and that you need to keep the money flowing. Where the disagreement starts is how do you increase the productivity of an economy? And the capitalist answer is that you have to allow, the capitalist answer is we don't know. There's no way to know what that is. The closest that we can come to knowing is to watch what the marketplace is doing. The market is going to tell us. So the operation of supply and demand, humans wanting something and humans having something to offer, that exchange is going to tell us after the fact what the most productive use of our efforts and our resources is going to be. And by raising the minimum wage, by interfering in the exchange between employers and employees, we're going to constrain the ability of the market to reach that maximally beneficial equilibrium between supply and demand. We're going to end up rewarding suboptimal behavior. The idea is that the market, so many restaurants, actually, I don't know about restaurants enough. It is not the case that all jobs in our economy pay the minimum wage. For example, I'm not paid the minimum wage. My job is paid better than minimum wage. Of course, none of you will be surprised by that. What is it about our economy, our economic system that allows for some jobs to pay more than minimum wage? Well, that is that presumably what I'm producing is worth more than simply the minimum amount of human productive labor. What capitalists argue and what many perspectives within the political economy challenge is that there is absolutely no other way to determine that other than the marketplace. The marketplace is, on capitalist orthodoxy, the most rational allocator of resources and the most rational allocator of rewards that humans have been able to develop so far. Political economy challenges the absoluteness of that claim. And it also challenges that as an accurate description of how the marketplace operates. One of the problems with the way economists describe everything is that they fail to include in the development of these markets and these marketplaces and these systems the ongoing, the continuing and the historically significant importance of politics all the way along, and of politics broadly construed, human relations. I mean, in the contribution that human relations have made to the organizing and the maintaining and the maximizing of the operation of the market is an aspect is a sort of a blind spot for economics. One manifestation of that is over the historical course of the development of economics, it's only very recently that allowances have been made for alternative accounts of decision making of individual economic actors. And I forget when it was, but it was within the last 20 years that the field of behavioral economics was even found a way to exist. It used to be assumed, it used to be simply an assumption of economics that economics models rational behavior, and that's all you need to know about the determinants of an economic actor, is that given the right amount of information, they will make the rational decision. But over the course of, I forget when it was, but the Nobel Economics Prize went to one of the founders of behavioral economics, whose work demonstrated that in fact there is a relatively autonomous contribution to the equilibrium function between supply and demand, that human economic actors are not simply benefit calculators, that there's more to it than that. Okay, so now the vocabulary that I want to call to your attention is, so economics basically studies structure, and there's essentially no room for agency in the way economists describe the behavior of humans in the marketplace, and they reduce the human contribution to that structure to a calculation, which is essentially non-agentic. There's no agency involved. There's no individuality. There's no identity in that decision. The political economy perspective looks to try to understand how those two relate to each other and determine each other. Okay, so now, a slightly longer version of this claim. Wait a minute, is this the right one? So the main part of Bowder's conclusion is that migration determines the labor market in Canada in a two-track way. That there's and what he's talking about basically is the contrast between high-skill migrants and, in quotes, low-skill markets. So brain surgeons who are trained who come from somewhere else, wherever they're trained, whether they're trained in India or whether they're trained here, international migrants with high market skills, compared to the migration of workers with low market skills. So for example, every summer, thousands of workers from Jamaica come and work in the agricultural sector in Canada. And that's been going on since 1966, I think, when that program started. And Bowder's point is that those two components operate very differently. And the difference between those two components maps on, roughly speaking, fairly well to the two kinds of trends that were observed in your comments to that first video. Now, this took me, as usual, longer. I'll try to wrap it up, but it's going to take me a few more minutes. So I hope that some of you at least will be able to stay for maybe 10 more minutes so that I can wrap this up. In the next video I asked you to watch, the video Who Gets In, the video basically is organized around two different trajectories of candidates for permanent residence in Canada. One of them is from Africa, the other one is from Hong Kong. And they showed us some students from Kenya, from Tanzania, and they showed us someone from Zaire. All of them were rejected because they were deemed either by Michael, what's his last name? I forget what Michael
Malloy.
Malloy. That's right. Thank you, Michael Malloy. There were candidates rejected by Michael Malloy in Africa, in Kenya where he was based, but also in Tanzania when he went to Dar es Salaam, and by the other immigration officers in Hong Kong who accepted. So we saw student activists who were rejected; they were deemed unsuitable. And we saw a businessman, an advertising executive, and a Filipina nanny who were accepted to Canada. And that, in a way, gives us an idea of how to understand how the new reality of Canadian immigration in a post-World War II world operates. The Kenyan students, Malloy acknowledged, so in particular with the Zairean soldier who was ultimately rejected by CSIS, Malloy acknowledged that he seemed like a very intelligent person. And Malloy even recommended him coming in. But CSIS put the kibosh on that. It's the Kenyan students who were rejected in Tanzania that I think are the most interesting. They showed the two sides of it, demonstrated some of what Harold Bauer is talking about in his books and his research, and that is that it's not enough that you have the formal qualifications. So these were students, law students and political science students, human beings who were otherwise attractive as potential migrants. But because they were, so on the one hand, because they were involved in political activism, they were deemed unlikely to be integratable into the Canadian framework. And also, and even more, I think, damning from a number of different points of view, independently of their qualifications to be migrants to Canada, because and Malloy said it explicitly. I was kind of surprised when I first watched it, because accepting them might anger the president or prime minister at the time of Kenya, Daniel Arap Moi. That on its own was a good enough reason to not do it. And why? Because Canadian international policy was looking to maintain good relations with Kenya. Now, why is that? Well, that's a very complicated question, and I'm not an expert in Canadian foreign policy in the 1970s, but it had at least some part to do with Canada's international business interests in Kenya. So our business interests are not furthered by accepting political activists from Kenya, especially when the government of Kenya is busy repressing their rights, torturing these students who themselves are fighting for the kinds of things that Canada always says it's in favor of. Now compare that to what happened in Hong Kong, where the kinds of skills and dispositions that the successful candidates in Hong Kong demonstrated was pro-business. It wasn't only that they were bringing money in, and I mean, it was that, and that's an important thing. And one of the negotiations that took place was the immigration officer asked Rotenberg, can he convince his client to sell some of his property so that he has more money to bring with him for the when he becomes a migrant? But the way it was framed in the film, an important component of what he's bringing is the contrast between what he is and what he has and what he does and what he wants and how he wants it, and what the African students were doing, what the skills they had. They were revolutionaries. The other guy was a businessman. And in Canada, we don't want revolutionaries. We want business people. Well, that absolutely maps onto the general discussion that Trebilcock and Kelly gave of the development of Canadian immigration policy, but it adds an extra element that Trebilcock and Kelly aren't interested in, and that's the internal connection between business interests and social interests. Now, the final piece, the final contrast I want to call to your attention is the other person who got in from Hong Kong. She wasn't rich, and she didn't have didn't come up. I'm sure she didn't have a doctorate in heart surgery. She was a nanny. She was going to come to Canada to take care of Canadian children for Canadian parents who had enough money after paying for their rent and their mortgage and all of this. They had enough money left over to pay for a nanny. And so the Canadian, right, if I remember, that's right. And, right, exactly. And she works 60 hours a week, something that I can tell you firsthand as someone who was born and grew up in Canada. Most people I know, some people I know say they work 60 hours a week, but the people I know well enough, I have trouble believing it. I'm sure there are some people who work 60 hours a week, but yeah, exactly. But I believe she does, and I believe there are loads of nannies in Canada who do actually have to work 60 hours a week. And for that 60 hours of work a week, they are not going to be saving up enough money on their own to buy a cottage and retire and so on. They get 60 hours a week and low wages. The nanny is someone who's willing to do the hard jobs that Canadians are not willing to do. 100% clear. The business interests argued this from the very beginning. And who benefits from that labor? So the other side of this is to get a good picture of who is it that wants, whose interests are being served by having nannies come to Canada. Which class of, which social group? It's that social group that can afford to hire a nanny in the first place. And what is it they do? The nanny allows them to put more time into work. And this is where Don's complicated question about minimum wage, so low wage and high wage. And this is the complex argument that Harold Bowder makes about labor segmentation. The advertising executive and the nanny presumably might have gotten on the same airplane and flown from Hong Kong to Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal for that matter. And when they get there, they go to different parts of Toronto. They do different kinds of work. They get paid different wages, and they're treated in different ways. But the difference is in their treatment are not absolutely unconnected from the other cultural and social factors that they bring with them. The Hong Kong business executive, when he gets to Canada, he's still a member of a visible minority. He still is going to carry with him some disadvantages in the labor market that are going to, I mean, the job he had, I think he worked for a big time. I mean, I know very little about advertising agencies, but I recognize the name of the firm he worked for. It was a very, very large international public relations outfit, and he had the Coca-Cola account in Hong Kong. The film was 1989, and I think they said he was making 300 grand a year or something. It's very big money. Lots of people in that world would want that job. If he comes to Canada and he's doing that job, that's a very in-demand job. And so he's got lots of advantages relative to lots of other people. He brings lots of skills to the table, and yet he's going to be, relatively speaking, marginally, at least marginally disadvantaged relative to other people competing for that job. Right, from the Canadian point of view, it's not just that he can come here and pay taxes for tomorrow. He's also, and this is what the film was successful in demonstrating, the immigration officers were crystal clear about how it is they understood Canadian policy interpreting what it is that those candidates were going to bring: a business spirit. They were going to bring an entrepreneurial aptitude. They were going to come and further the business agenda. Whereas the students from Tanzania, what they were doing in Tanzania is they were furthering the worker perspective. They were the party, I can't pronounce it, I forget what the name of the party was that the student was a member of. I went and did a little bit of reading about it. It was the one, there were several at the time, but it was one of the socialist parties in Kenya who were pushing back against all kinds of different forms of oppression. But Malloy was at least honest when he said, I can't even imagine why he would want to do that. The immigration officers who are implementing Canadian immigration policy can't even imagine someone organizing workers to defend workers' rights. Now, lots of people I know can't imagine that, but in general, they are not the ones who are implementing our policy. Okay, so you've been very patient, and I appreciate that. Well, if you hand it in a little bit late, there's going to be a late penalty, I'm afraid. So if you take, so, you know, we'll have to see. If you have a specific reason that you need an extension, then you'll have to send me. I guess in your case it's another email. The deadline stands, and so if people have individual cases, individual scenarios, I will take it on a case-by-case basis. But I can't give it a blanket extension. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the recording